I am an African.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Africa for Dummies show. As always, we're here with another great topic and another great guest. As always, I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Zengi. How are you doing, Zengi?
Hello, everybody. I'm doing very good. This is our first episode of the year, actually. So
Oh, yeah.
exciting. 2024.
Yeah.
Any resolutions? No?
No. We just keep on plowing ahead and plowing through, and no resolution. Yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So,
I'm just on
yeah.
positive vibe. Oh yeah. I don't want to be one of those gym guys who just end up. But
Yeah. No, I get you.
no serious.
Yeah. No, yeah, anyways, although we don't have any more serious resolutions, we have another great guest lined up on the podcast today, but who's going to basically tell us how African countries lose their authority over minds. And before we get into that, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to support this channel by liking or subscribing or hitting that notification bell. This channel exists to simplify complex African issues and simplify them so that we're able to understand what's going on in our country. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest for today, who is Dr. Ben Radley, a lecturer in international development at the University of Bath. His research usually focuses on the political economic transformation in Africa. He's also a member of the editorial working group for the review of African political economy and an affiliated member of the Center of Mining Research at the Catholic University of Bukavu, DR Congo. That was a mouthful, but welcome, Dr. Bradley. Dr. Radley, sorry.
Yeah, and Ben is fine, please. And hi both
Okay.
of you. Good to be on the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. But as I was reading your background, it sounds a lot like somebody who was born on the continent. Explain to us how somebody who's in the UK ends up being interested in DR Congo and mining and economic transformation in Africa.
Yeah, I suppose the interest came from my university studies where I did a postgraduate degree in development studies, and I did studied a lot there, questions around African development. And then that took me after the degree to working for several years for a range of NGOs. And then I spent the best part of a decade living in Eastern and Central Africa. Most of that time was in Congo, working a lot on labor, human rights issues in the mining sector, with a particular focus on the mining sector. And so that's where it came from.
Oh, okay. No, that's quite an interesting way to find yourself into African political issues and particularly the DRC Congo is also an area of interest because I think a lot of people on the continent are very surprised because I think DRC Congo is resource rich, really. Like it has I think almost you could literally find almost every single resource there. So a lot of people are surprised at the fact that it's one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet it has such an enormous and vast amount of resources. It kind of points people to this thing in Africa called the resource curse. Could you potentially shed light on how this resource curse came about and if it even exists, if you think there is some sort of truth to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think, worth saying that the resource curse, while it's often discussed in the context of Africa, it has been applied more broadly as well. It's not something that's just seen as specific to Africa. And then, of course, as you alluded to in your question there, it's also debated to what extent it does or doesn't exist to begin with. But I think at its simplest, the resource curse, which became very popular as an idea from the 1990s and 2000s onwards, and still holds a lot of traction today, I think, But it basically, at its simplest, is the idea that countries such as the Congo, which are incredibly rich in natural resources, minerals and metals, extractive industries, see worse development outcomes, whether that's economic development, human development, than countries with lesser wealth in natural resources. So it's seen as this, I suppose, paradox, and then it becomes this idea that it's a curse to have such natural resource wealth because it appears to lead to inferior development outcomes. Now, as you say, does this problem exist? As I say, it's a debate. People have debated it. There are some people who don't see much value in this idea of a resource curse. And I think a lot of the debate is around the fact that there might well be a correlation there between many countries where you have high levels of resources and potentially lower development outcomes, however measured or understood. But then the big question is, well, what's causing those outcomes and what's driving those outcomes, and how intimately related is that to the natural resource wealth or not, right? So I think there's a big debate to be had, but it certainly tapped into, I think, the predominant idea that people have in their minds when it comes to the resource curse, and Africa in particular. And it's not only about this, but I think people will often tend to think about African governments and governance and corruption. And I think it's not only about that, but I feel in terms of the popular imagination, at least, when people talk about or think about the resource curse in Africa, they will often straight away go to corruption. And this is, and the presence of natural resource wealth feeds into a mode of governance which is inclined more towards state patronage and corruption than national developmentalist goals and ambitions.
That's interesting. So would you say that, because the way the system is right now, it kind of sounds like, I guess you would say like the corruption kind of came about, like, was this corrupt system still in existence prior to colonization, or were the mines running in some sort of different way prior to that?
Yeah, so I should have said there that, I don't personally sort of put so much emphasis or focus on corruption as the issue here. I was more just explaining, I suppose, what the resource curse is and how it's explained. Personally, I think there's far too much emphasis placed on African governance and corruption as the way to understand certain development outcomes or trajectories or the way things are on the continent today. I think there's an almost obsessive focus with that as sort of the prime driver of everything. I think often what that excludes or leaves out of the question is, the external context and, the global economy and the external constraints, for a kind of a quite narrow focus on what's happening internally. Not to say those issues don't exist, right, or that they're not there. You go to Congo or Nigeria, or people won't take you seriously if you deny that those problems exist. But it's just the question is, how much influence do they have on these development outcomes that people are thinking of and focusing on when they're looking at the resource curse? And so in terms of the, how does that relate to the colonial experience or the historically, which I think was your question. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the first thing to say is, in terms of natural resource wealth, it wasn't the colonial encounter that necessarily was the beginning of the exploitation of natural resources, right? Okay. So you had a lot of mineral and metal exploitation taking place across the continent. And one of the most sort of famous examples of this that's become increasingly popularized in recent years, through Howard French, published a book, Born into Blackness. You might have come across that. And then there's also the historian Isaac Samuel, who writes a lot about this recently, or has written some about it, is this pilgrimage taken by Mansa Musa, I think I'm correct in saying, in the 1300s, a pilgrimage from West Africa through Cairo to Mecca, where he was documented to have traveled with, a huge retinue, hundreds and thousands of people and hundreds of tons of gold, and distributing this wealth as he went. This became sort of a very famously documented story that kind of traveled to Europe and other parts of the world. And then, in places like Congo, you have, evidence of a long history of pre-colonial copper exploitation and so on. And so it didn't begin with the colonial period, but the colonial encounter did fundamentally alter the way in which the control and ownership over the exploitation of these resources, who controlled them, who owned them, and to whose benefit were they being produced fundamentally, all that shifted and changed through the colonial encounter. So I think it was a fundamental shift in the way in which that productive activity was taking place and who was benefiting from it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. What?
Yeah, I think Mansa Musa was also, I think some records have it that he was the richest man to have either ever lived or definitely of his time.
Yeah.
Because lying the streets with gold and going on, I think he was going to make.
Yeah.
There is the big history of minerals in abundance in many African pre-colonial African civilizations.
Yeah.
Even Ghana, if you think about it, the golden ornaments, and you think about it.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next. Yeah. So moving on to the next question, we just wanted to get when you read books or colonialism, when they're explaining it to kids, normally they give you the 3 G's or the 3 C's, which is gold, glory, and God, or 3 C's, which is civilization, commerce, and Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, what sort of catapulted the expansion of mineral production in Africa? And could you tell us about the structure precisely? Because, people also talk about the line of rail, if you look at the railway maps of Southern Africa in particular, or East Africa, they normally just it's normally for extraction. Could you just give us an explanation of what brought the external powers into Africa? What drove the economies to come into Africa, and then what did they do specifically, and how did they design this sort of mineral exploitation in Africa?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll focus in terms of, the motivations behind it is, I feel like that's almost a whole other discussion in itself as well. And there were many and varied. But in terms of how they went about setting up the mineral extraction and what took place there, I think we could use the Democratic Republic of Congo, as an illustrative example. Although, of course, things took place differently in each part of the continent at the time. But what you tend to see during this colonial encounter, as the European powers moved in and began to discover increasing amounts, in many cases, of mineral wealth, is what you saw in the case of Congo, for example, was under both King Leopold and then increasingly under the Belgian Congo in the early 1900s, was a high level of investment from Belgian industrialists into the mining and transport sectors. As you say, when you look at the transport infrastructure, much of it was put in place simply to get minerals from point of extraction to export. And you see those dynamics continue to go on today in the Congo, where you have both China and the US and Europe putting in place plans to extract minerals east and west from the Congo. So there's a colonial continuity there. But so there's heavy investment in the transport and mining sectors. And there was also a concerted effort on the part of the Belgian government in the Congo to suppress alternative trading networks and alternative trading routes. So there was a real shift in the diversity and complexity of the pre-existing economy. And there was a real concerted effort to move the economy towards being a mineral exporter, and for those minerals to be exported to the colonizing powers. And so at obviously low prices, where what you saw taking place was super profits going to colonial mining companies because their production was based upon the super exploitation of African labor. It was African labor that was either forced labor or that was being paid extremely low wages, and then being exported to Europe and feeding into ongoing processes of capitalist development that was taking place in Europe, right? So I think what you did see generally was a real shift in the ways in which those colonial economies were then forcibly inserted into the global economy represented, I think, a fundamental break from what had existed before, and a fundamental rupture with what had existed before, and the way African economies had been inserted into regional and global networks of trade prior to the colonial encounter. It really did shift in a lot of areas that had mineral and metal wealth, and went in this direction, having a much more narrow, concentrated economic structure, which was highly dependent upon export of minerals, in a way that didn't exist to that scale or that sense before. It would be how I would see it, anyway.
Yeah, and it's just interesting. I just found I'm really obsessed with maps, so I like looking at how maps have changed over the time, and the railway lines and all of these things, and the post-colonial narrative in Africa is normally about redistribution and all of these things. And there's a song by a famous South African trumpet player called Duma Sekela, and it's called Skimela, and he talks about people going onto this train from the hinterlands of Southern Africa to the gold mines of Johannesburg. And when they talk about development efficiency, they talk about the line of rail and how, even the main road is called Cairo Road, being by as Cape to Cairo ambition, and the railway line accompanies that road, and it goes from the Copperbelt region in through Livingstone down to Zimbabwe and into South. That was very interesting. And when you look at the development lines in the cities, they're normally around that as well. So now, like, if we move on to the post-colonial period, what did governments do about what they were given after colonization? So why, could you just give us rationing for why many of these governments pursued policies of, nationalization? There were state-owned companies in many countries. For some countries, it's a golden era. I know for Zambia, older generations look at it in wonderful terms. And in other countries, I know they talk about it in wonderful terms. Even in countries that you have studied closely, in like Zaire, I've heard some Congolese speak of those type of some type of nostalgia, like a boom. So Zaire, the just Zambia. So what? Can you just tell us what all of this was about? The nationalization, even in West Africa, in Ghana, the nationalization, and where did these glory days go? Because for us, we haven't experienced the radiance.
Yeah. No, and you're absolutely right. It's the same in the Congo when you talk about this 1960s, early 1970s, from people who lived through it or were very close to it. Yeah, they talk about it with a certain sense of nostalgia, which I think on the one hand reflects the trajectory since then, right, in Ghana and Nigeria and Congo and elsewhere. But on the other hand, I think speaks to the fact that things were quite different. And I think the 1960s and the early 70s across much of the continent is a really important historical period to keep hold of and to learn from when thinking about policy and planning and strategy today. So in terms of what went on, and as you rightly said, there was kind of a broad process of nationalization of mining sectors, putting in place of state-owned enterprises. I think it was sort of alluded to when we were talking about the last question of the colonial encounter. I think fundamentally what had gone on was that anti-colonial resistance movements had seen very clearly what was taking place, and that they had lost ownership and control, sovereignty over their resources, which were being produced and extracted to the benefit of the colonial powers. And so I think that was largely why the state was such a target of these anti-colonial movements, and they wanted to essentially overthrow and capture and gain control of the state apparatus and try and shift the logic within which their economies had been set up, right? To shift the logic away from kind of serving external needs and interests and towards trying to serve internal demand, internal needs and internal interests. And I think the governments of that era saw regaining control over how these resources were being produced and distributed, and to whose benefit as a fundamental part of that process. And so, yeah, you indeed saw a range of what might be considered radical policies by some in this direction. So you talked about in Zambia with the late Kenneth Kaunda, who was one of the leading figures in putting in place the copper price. You have OPEC today, right? The organization for the petroleum exporting countries. So they did something similar with copper in the I think it was maybe the late 60s, early 70s, where they did put in place a copper board to try and control prices. I think Nyerere in Tanzania put a ban on extractives, a similar way that you have in El Salvador in Latin America. There is a ban on, I think it's metal extraction. So Nyerere said, until we develop in Tanzania the productive capacities and capabilities and the productive forces at a level where we can begin to benefit from this, we're going to put a ban on who can be exporting these minerals. So you had a whole range of, and then introduction of state-owned enterprises. And it was indeed a relatively brief, but I would also agree with, I think, your assessment that it was there was a lot was gained in a relatively short period of time. I think it was when you look closely in different country case studies and stories, that kind of 10, 15-year period of the 1960s, early 1970s, huge gains in kind of social and economic development in a relatively, as I say, brief period of time were achieved, not only because of the nationalisation of mining sectors. This was a more broader kind of political philosophy taking place across finance, but other sectors of the economy. I think in Congo, something like 40% of the economy was under national public ownership by a certain point. So it was a kind of broader strategic objective, and you indeed saw some pretty rapid progress in kind of a 10-15 year period. But then, as you say, it quickly came undone, and we can talk about that more if you'd like, in terms of, well, why did it come undone and what happened. But I think that was the broad kind of spirit of the time.
Yeah, I think you've sort of, like, in the conversation, you're sort of touched into like your the way your article is sort of written as well. So I just wanted to like sort of I think because Zenke is also somebody who's researched most of these things, like I think quite in depth, but I think maybe I'm the dummy in this conversation for now. So just to kind of get like I think the way that the article is written. So in the beginning, you mentioned that you have to blame the African state. And I think you kind of touched on this when you said that a lot of emphasis has been placed on the corruption, which is true. But you also talk about these external. Why is that the first step, and how exactly, maybe using some of the examples that we used, how does that work exactly?
Yeah, so the first step, so in the article you're referring to there, what I tried to do is lay out what I talk about as the 3 steps through which Africa lost control of this briefly regained sovereignty over its resource wealth. And the first step I talk about there is, as you say, blaming the African state, which was what happened when this period came to an end around the mid-1970s to the late 1970s. What you saw in many of these countries that had been going through quite rapid progress of social and economic change and development is that all came undone pretty quickly from the mid-1970s onwards. And the World Bank, at the time, a range of American economists, Northern economists, who were looking at this, the prime explanation that they came up with as to why this period had come undone so quickly was due to state mismanagement, state inefficiencies, let's say, and mismanagement. So, bloated state bureaucracies, too much state intervention, too much price distortion. And this was the understanding. So it was basically saying that the African state is too heavily engaged and involved in the national economy. And that is why we're now seeing this period of stagnation and decline in many African countries. But of course, I think the problem with that, or at least what I would argue, and what many others would see as a problem with that understanding, is that, and there's this great book by, which is, I'd recommend to anyone, which I happen to just have here actually, by the late Malawian Tandika Mkandawiri and Charles Saludu, which is Our Continent, Our Future, African Perspectives on Structural Adjustment. They write out very clearly that this understanding of blaming the African state was too narrowly focused on internal dynamics, and it completely ignored the external context. And what you had in terms of the external context in the 1970s, I think just very briefly, the most important things that took place that come to mind were you had a huge drop you had in commodity prices and demand, because you had a long period of stagnation and inflation in the global north. So demand for commodities went down dramatically, prices crashed, and there was a huge increase in the cost of oil. So for a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the copper price crashed by, I think, went down by, I don't know, 50, halves or in about 6 month periods. And the cost of oil imports quadrupled over a 4-year period. So, if 95% of your export revenue is dependent upon a few minerals, and the price of those minerals crash, and you're importing 4 times more to meet your fuel needs than you were paying before, I don't care if you're the cleanest government in the world, good luck managing that and coming out of that successfully and smoothly. And so the issue was that these kind of dynamics and constraints weren't given due consideration. I mean, and it was all about the African state. And so that was then that was the first stage in this process of losing control, is the problem was seen to be the African state and the way in which it was mismanaging the economy. And then the objective came to be to take the state out of the picture, essentially, and to privatize the sector.
Brought in the structural adjustment program, which leads us to the second stage of liberalize and privatize. I think what Zengi was actually previously talking about. I think I might have looked at, touched on this basically when I was looking into the history of maize in Zambia. You sort of see how as you said, the country was highly dependent on these resources to essentially finance most of their programs that they started, like free education, the subsidies for agriculture, and all those sorts of things. But now that the resources of the mines were taken away, it really created a serious problem. Would that be a correct assessment, or maybe there's something that I've missed there?
In terms of that was what led to then to stage 2.
Okay, and
yeah.
So also, what's so important in stage 2 for? Okay, so then now the state has essentially lost the mines, and now the mines are in the hands of foreign powers. So now they've essentially lost a significant amount of that. Then, which now pushes on to stage 3, right? Which is
I mean, we can talk about.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No problem. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about, the liberalizing and privatizing component, it is worth touching on that briefly if we have time.
Yeah.
Because, I might have misunderstood your previous question, but yeah, I think your reading of it is absolutely correct. And I think, it's also important to say, when you look at the histories of some of these state-owned mining companies, there's a Zambian economist, Greaves Chelwa, who's written about this, where he says, the success of a mining sector is not to do with who owns the mines or who runs the mines. It's about prices. Are the prices up? Are they strong? Or are they not? And if you look at the history of many of these state-owned mining companies in Zambia, Congo, and elsewhere, they were performing very well as prices were, in the 60s and 70s. And it was when the crash happened that things started to go backwards. So it wasn't to do with the ownership and management. It wasn't only to do, and I think the ownership and management, to my mind, is this sort of a red herring, or it's it's kind of diverting attention from the real structural constraints of sustained development through extraction. And but you're right that the understanding of the African state and blaming the African state was then what justified the privatization of the sector, liberalizing the sector, and opening it up to foreign investments, essentially. And then what you saw in the 90s and 2000s was, high levels of investment in African commodities, and a revival of production levels from the 2000s onwards, I suppose, and across a far wider group of countries than had been the case in the 1960s and 1970s. You now have a lot of countries that are seen by these investors as described as, frontier economies, or right, where it's, I think Burkina Faso might be an example of that. It didn't have as significant gold production historically as it has today. And so you had a huge level of investment, production levels started going up again, and in many countries are now at kind of historically unprecedented levels. And what you have is pretty much a landscape dominated by the control of foreign mining corporations, fundamentally, across the continent, who are now back in ownership and control of the sector.
Yeah, and since they've gained more power, I think that the state has, I guess, less power over these mines and things like that. Now you sort of see an increase in these artisanal miners or illegal miners, particularly in Zambia. I think Zambia, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's called Black Mountain or something like that. And I think I recently also saw a viral video of sorry about that. I recently saw a viral video of some miners in Congo literally saving. Where the mine was literally collapsing and they were saving each other from there. And so the question is, why are these groups, vilified? Because I think it's something that's seen as wrong, but then it's kind of odd because these are people that are coming from those particular countries. They have the right to to collect the resources themselves rather than a foreign institute.
Yeah, exactly. So why are they vilified? Which is a great question. And indeed, that video, I saw that same video, and it was a crazy video of these miners just coming out of the hole, first time, just jumping out of the dust, covered in. But so why are they vilified? I think the most important reason that comes to mind as to why they've been vilified in terms of economic policy and planning is this idea that artisanal and small-scale African miners it's an unproductive, inefficient subsistence activity, and therefore it's not of interest to economists as a poverty alleviation strategy, as a national development strategy. It's labor-intensive. It's not using much capital or technology, and so it's not seen as an efficient development strategy economically. And so there's been a preference for instead, industrial mining, basically, highly capital intensive, high levels of productivity is kind of the economic capitalist logic, I suppose. And so they were marginalized within this whole process of mining sector liberalization and privatization, and they were criminalized fundamentally because they didn't hold private property concession rights to the deposits that they had been working on. And so when you had transnational mining corporations coming in to take hold of those deposits, they had no formal claims to stay on that land. And so often, and this still takes place today, you have mass scale forced displacements of these miners, tens of thousands of miners at a time. Often police and military are leading these sweeps, as they're often talked about. And so these miners are being pushed out to the most marginal deposits, and taken off the most prized deposits, which are being taken control of by the corporations. So they were, but then they also become vilified in a sense because they're often associated with, rightly or wrongly, they're often associated with human rights violations or child labor problems, links to conflict financing, and so on, and these sorts of issues that particularly liberal, Western liberals do like to focus on a lot, and so kind of get vilified for that reason as well. And then the end result is that they're basically I think, a real misstep in which these millions of African miners and workers across the continent are sort of pushed out of kind of ownership and control of these resources in favor of foreign corporations predominantly. It is starting to change a little bit, and there are some shifts in some countries where things are starting to move back in another direction. But I do think this vilification is quite misguided and often misunderstands a lot of the developmental benefits and advantages that sector has to offer to local and national economies.
That's very interesting because, and then it's fascinating that you actually wrote about it, because even like when growing up, they're names and nicknames for people who do that, and it's a derogatory term. So like in Zambia, and normally there's sort of the name is sort of coupled with gangsters and bandits and like, high level criminal organizations. So in Zambia, the term Jerabos. In South Africa, I think it's Zamas.
You had ninjas in Congo.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it's never a good thing when really they are the only, like people would talk about how, if you, older generations of Zambians would say that when they were growing up, they were called the copper spoon children. In Botswana, they called the diamond babies. But when it comes to, the average experience of people from these countries, very unlikely that they have actually seen a diamond mine. They most likely don't have shares in any diamonds or anything. So these guys are basically at the forefront of these things, even though, it's quite rude and the way they're doing it. But I think one thing that's also interesting after privatization is the incoming of multiple actors, international actors. So, people talk about the new Scramble of Africa. Our first episode was actually on the new Scramble of Africa. And so we see not only the traditional, the UK, the former colonizers and the Anglo-American companies and conglomerates. We also see China, we see India, we see the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all of these countries coming in and getting shares and majority shares. I think in China, in the DRC, I read somewhere that almost 70%, there's what is it called? A monopsony and a monopoly. China was almost becoming a monopsony and a monopoly, which basically means you control the production and you also control you are the market as well, the dominant market. So most of the mines are owned by China and the client was China. So if you could just speak about that and sort of this massive influx of international players in the mineral industry in Africa. Even in Ghana, there were protests against Chinese multinationals coming in oil fields and so on and so forth. So could you just speak about that? And is there anything Africa can do to benefit from it? Because normally people talk about how, as just a pawn and so on and so forth. Listening, we also have an episode in China as well. You could check that out as well if you want to know more about Africa and China.
Yeah, well, is there anything that Africa... I mean, you're right. This huge amount of interest in what are being called critical minerals and metals that are needed to drive the kind of hoped for transition to low carbon economies in society globally, which are, littered across the continent in abundance. And so you have increasing attention from, all sides of the globe centered on Africa's minerals. Yeah, on the one hand, that, should play to governments' benefits in terms of being able to leverage and negotiate contracts for their products if they have more people interested in them than one, for example. But in terms of, and there's also a lot of excitement about the potential for this to deliver development, right, to Africa. This is sort of the big thing that people have excited, kind of a lot of development corporations and agencies and so on are very sort of focused on is, how can African governments and countries leverage this supposed opportunity to achieve national development aspirations. And so that, of course, there's always opportunity, and there's always, we should never completely write off or foreclose, right, what's possible and what can happen. But I think, at least my own perspective on it would be, if you look at the African Union, AU 2063, what is one of their defining aspirations? it's essential. It's for African countries by 2063 to have structurally transformed away from a dependence on exporting primary commodities and minerals and metals, and to have created, full and productive employment for all, and to be prosperous, right? And to take its place within the global economy. And so if that is your aspiration 50 years from now, and you look at many countries, I'm sure it's similar in Ghana, it is the case in Congo, and their national development strategies are basically aimed towards that. They want to become middle income countries, or low middle income, high income, right? That's what they're looking for. And so that is what you're looking for, and that's what you want to achieve. I think fundamentally you have to get serious about industrial policy. As one of my mentors said to me once, if you don't have a serious industrial policy, I think all bets are off. If there's one common thread in the history of countries that have gone through processes of economic transformation, sustained processes over time, where they've diversified their economy and transformed them structurally away from that dependence on exports, the one commonality is those countries got serious at a certain point in time about having an industrial policy that was not just focused on following a comparative advantage in your minerals and metals. And so in terms of course, there's opportunities there. There's always, ways and means through which, despite the constraints, if you have the political will and you have the strategy and the policies, things can be achieved, right? And if you can get some of the fiscal revenue from the exports and put that in place and reinvest those in developing other sectors that are deemed to be strategic, yeah, absolutely, this can happen. But then, of course, the question is, well, how likely is that to happen in a country like Congo, which has just voted in, Tshisekedi for another 5-year term under the same political logics of Kabila? So there's like a real world question of, well, how likely is this to happen? And is it just going to benefit a very narrow kind of political elite in these countries, which I think is, sadly looking like the more likely scenario in a country like Congo. What is going on is in the Congo is that you have a very narrow political class that is benefiting from that interest that's coming in this new scramble for Africa. And then it's the political struggle in Congo, that's being led by, different Congolese movements and activists to try and shift that. Open question as to, how successful they will be and how much they can shift in what shorter time period. Because one of the things with these minerals and metals is obviously once they're gone, right? They're not coming back. And these mines are so much more productive today than they were in the 80s and 90s. And that's what's kind of frightening when you look at the speed at which they're extracting these minerals. Once they are gone, they are gone. So, but of course there are things, and I think you could also look to the 60s and 70s, as we were talking about earlier, look to some of the policies that were pursued by governments at that time, look to some of those lessons that can be learned from the past. But yeah, I think it can't just be done in kind of a trickle down way where you hope that exporting these minerals will then, drive all this transformational change and make Africa kind of prosperous continent by 2063 on its own. I think, there needs to be a serious engagement with industrial policy and how to use the benefits of those exports as a way to develop other sectors which are more relevant to the needs and interests of people on the continent, right? And that can also absorb more labor. Because these sectors, these mineral metal export sectors, they're so capital intensive. They're not, and as as we all know, one of the huge issues facing so many countries on the continent is unemployment. Thousands and thousands of graduates coming out every year from universities with nowhere to go. And so industrialization, to my mind, you can think about it as, how do you have urbanization without slums? Something else a mentor said to me at one time, right? How do you absorb productively? And the way to do that is not through just exporting minerals. You have to have some sort of way in which you're going to use some of that to develop these other sectors that are more relevant to your internal domestic economy, I think. But the opportunity is always there. You have to, but at the same time, there's a tension there, right? Because, I'm sorry, just to finish, I'm talking a lot, but the tension is the tension is that the more that Africa is the tension is that Asia and the global north, let's speak broadly, what do they see from Africa? What do they want Africa? They want Africa to basically provide as many of its minerals and metals as cheaply as it can, as quickly as it can, which they can then use to develop their own green technologies and export them globally, including back to Africa, right? And this is the geopolitical struggle that's going on right now. Is that Africa has a very specific vision, and African governments have a very clear vision for where they would like to go. But that vision conflicts fundamentally with the vision that the European Union has for Africa within its net zero plan. And so there's a real tension there. And the more that the EU and other actors push Africa into this position of exporting commodities, in some ways, the harder it then becomes to escape that position. It becomes self-reinforcing after a time. So there's a struggle there, because what Africa and African governments want to achieve fundamentally goes against the grain of what the rest of the global economy wants and needs from Africa, which is cheap resources very quickly, please. And don't industrialize or raise your prices. Thank you very much. So that and that's that's what's playing out, isn't it? I think at the moment. So it won't be easy, clearly.
Yeah. No, I mean, that was. I mean, I could have put it better. And I think one thing that stuck out the most actually is once it's gone, it's gone. Once the mineral is gone, it's gone. Which leads us into the other question, which has done its rounds on social media. I think there was a famous song about like people in Congo singing to Apple. Something like that about the supply chain and everything, and pleading to Apple. I don't know if that was real or it was a stunt. I'm not too sure.
Okay, I missed that.
Yeah, but yeah, let me get on with the question. But also a side note, for someone who's been studying and living in that part of the Congo particularly, you're quite an optimistic guy for. I'm not. No offense. It's not always roses when you talk about Congolese minerals. And so anyway, regarding the minerals, Africa's mining is also dependent on external actors. And as I mentioned, Apple, is a company and the phone, Apple, iPhone. The minerals are often taken away and given value elsewhere, and depending on the market elsewhere, in the metal exchange in London, not in Africa. I don't know how many minerals the UK has, but all the minerals in Africa are, brokered and their values assessed in London. And the fun fact, actually, in one of Kaunda's books, he actually talked about how some Pan-Africanists are discussing moving the metal exchange to Africa, but that never took off.
There we go. Another good example from the past. Yeah, great.
Yeah. So I mean, my question basically is there a chance for Africa to gain control of their resources, given the level of influence from external market? And you also mentioned the, moving to net zero and how that contradicts Africa's own ambitions. So what is there any how does Africa actually do this? Is it possible? Is it feasible? Is someone stupid to be optimistic in all of this?
There's always a chance, right? I think we have to believe in the possibilities, even if we might not necessarily think that they are likely to take place. So, I do think there's always a chance and there's always a space. And you definitely have seen in recent years, and some are talking about it as the rise of resource nationalism in some countries. But what you have seen, I think, over the last several years is in several African countries, the passing of new mining codes and introduction of new mining codes that I do think represent perhaps the first generation of mining codes since the 1980s that are beginning to push back against this liberalisation and privatisation that we've been talking about that took place in the kind of 80s and 90s. Tanzania would be a country where there's been examples in recent years of the Tanzanian government taking concessions back from foreign corporates which have been lying dormant and returning those concessions to artisanal and small-scale miners, for example. Yeah. I mean, now how much is that? I don't know the context intimately. I don't know how much that has been sustained and being continued, but it makes the point that the state holds sovereignty. And if it decides it wants to move and do certain things, it can move and do those things. So the possibility is there. Of course, the difficulty is, these mining corporates are extremely powerful. They can now take governments to international courts of arbitration and dispute settlement. So they hold far much more power than they held in the 60s and 70s, for example. And the power of the state has declined relative to that. So there's an enormous challenge in that sense. But Yeah, absolutely. I think that the possibilities are there, the lessons are there from the past. I think the strategies and policies are broadly sort of known and the ideas are out there. I mean, cobalt with Congo would be one good example. We were talking earlier about the copper price having when Congo and others put in place this international copper price mechanism. I don't see why Congo and Zambia and a few other countries couldn't do that with cobalt. You know, the global production and export of cobalt is dominated 2/3 by Congo. Congo holds half of the world's known reserves. I think produces around 2/3 of global supply. Why not get together with 2 or 3 other countries and try and control prices and other conditions and leverage as much as you can the benefits from that? But then the issue comes back to what we were just talking about, is that if you do that, if they were to do that and they were to try and do that, what would happen? What would happen is that countries would try, the importers of cobalt would try to move away as quickly as possible from using cobalt in their technologies, which is already happening. You're already seeing in the US and elsewhere, you know, huge efforts to reduce their dependence on cobalt, precisely because they're concerned about how dependent they are on the Congo for supply. So again, right, this is where you get back into this, you know, this tension, this geopolitics. Is there any efforts that African governments make to walk in these directions of getting better returns for their exports? On the other end, they're likely to see kind of either resistance or a move away from that particular mineral. And so, you know, again, it comes back to, I think, my main kind of thought and feeling in all of this is that I don't think it's wise to just bank on this new interest in African resources as the way through which, you know, transformational change is going to happen. It's much better to focus on internal markets and demand, I would say. You know, you take Congo or Ethiopia or Nigeria, you know, huge countries, huge populations. And I mean, I don't know, yeah, I'm sure you've observed this yourself, right? When you, like, I think of Congo and I think of all these products that there's a huge demand for internally, basic products, toothpicks, or you go into any, you go into any Congolese household, you've got to see, you know, no matter how rich or poor, you'll have a similar suite of products, right? There'll be toothbrushes, there'll be toothpaste, there'll be plastic cups and saucers, there'll be thermos flasks, there'll be, you know, there's all this stuff. Where's it all coming from? It's mostly coming from China. Not only, but mostly. But how difficult would it be, or how much investment would you really need to support those domestic industries to emerge, right? And begin to generate, and you'd employ much more labor, you know, through going kind of labor-intensive manufacturing. Just need some that's the industrial strategy I'm talking about. Look at these kind of sectors where you have huge domestic markets, right? And I would say start there. Not to say, obviously, you have the minerals and you need to have strategies in place for that as well. But I do think it's extremely challenging to use and to rely on the mineral sector as the way through which you're going to, you know, you're going to achieve your aims in that. Yeah, you're going to achieve what you want to achieve. Which, when you read like the national development strategies of the Congo, that's basically what they're trying to do. They say, you know, we're going to use the mining sector to become a middle-income country by 2030 and a high-income country by 2060. And I think, okay, but you need a bit more than that in place. You know, it would be my feeling. Otherwise, I think you're probably likely just to see what we've seen over the last few decades.
Yeah, it's almost like an addiction, like because in Congo, they both Congo and Zambia have had various interactions about creating an electric vehicle supply.
Yeah,
and then
yes,
the you know, there's the famous Tanzania-Zambia railway line, which was built under the guise of freeing Zambia towards relying on exports to South Africa, but that railway line now goes east to China, so that we can export copper to China. And then today there's the Lobito railway line, which goes from Zambian Congo through Angola to the west,
exactly,
to
United
States, and
which the US,
so I mean that just shows that it's not necessarily over. No one is really thinking about going beyond. And the Zambian president talked about a 3 million metric ton target for the next 10 years. So it's not. It's still, and I think probably the copper prices have also motivated people to be like, oh, wait, hold on, we're still wonders. We still want to be, you know, copper junkies, and, you know, junkies. But yeah, one question I had more so is your sort of personal experience and in terms of being in Congo and these places in the mining sites and so on, what type of lives and experiences did you catch on with the people that are there, the illegal miners, the sort of the hierarchy, the big corporate people? Could you just put us into sort of like your experience of that?
Yeah. I think, and I have spent, maybe collectively, a lot of time, particularly in artisanal and small scale mine sites, some time on industrial mine sites, but a little bit less. And I think the one thing that struck me the most about that experience was, I suppose, just how different it was relative to the narrative that you often read in the West, in particular, about artisanal and small scale mining, which is, as we were talking about earlier, is vilified and seen as, home to all these development problems and issues, and people should just not be mining. We should just be doing other things, and it needs to be industrially mined by responsible companies. But I think from spending time in those sites and in those kind of local areas and communities, you just see it very differently, and it's obviously a lot more nuanced and complex than that, and also the way in which that form of local mining is seen by many or most Congolese is very different to that Western media narrative. It's understood with a lot more nuance than you often get in kind of media coverage. Yes, they realize the issues associated with it, but they also realize and appreciate how much employment it provides and how much how much money it injects in the economy, which circulates locally. And so I think the big difference when you're talking about the hierarchies and you're thinking about kind of what I would call local Congolese mining and then kind of foreign industrial mining, the biggest noticeable difference, at least when I think about it now, is the different perceptions of those sectors by Congolese. I think, not to say that artisanal and small scale mining isn't contested, and of course there are some concessions that are fiercely contested and so on, but I think it's much more embedded basically in the kind of local cultural, social, economic fabric, and it's much more embedded in it and related to it and connected to it, and therefore has a much higher degree of legitimacy, right? Because there's an aspect of sort of, I suppose, sovereignty, resource sovereignty there. But then, people's perceptions generally to industrial mines, which are in Congo have been for a long time now, mostly majority owned by foreign corporations, it's seen very differently because it's seen that the benefits from that industrial production largely accrue overseas, and the benefits don't get felt locally. Of course, I'm simplifying, and generalizing, but I think broadly that's certainly kind of been my experience of how those mines are perceived and seen by Congolese, is that the minerals are extracted, and they're not quite sure, what benefit is left from that locally. And one of the surprising things is you often go into mining areas that were previously mined by Congolese, and then a mining company comes in, and you hear stories from people about, how much tougher life is now than how it was before, when there was money circulating in the local economy. And there was, high levels of employment, and now there's lower levels of employment, and the money isn't circulating in the way that it once was. So yeah, I just think it's just different, I suppose, to how it's sort of often presented and portrayed in Western media coverage, and I think the miners themselves perceive themselves very differently, right? And I think they perceive their own lives and their own kind of jobs and work very differently to how we might think of them, when we see the stories that are in the Guardian or whatever website about how terrible things are in those places and spaces. They also have like a very different understanding.
Yeah, Hollywood is all blood diamonds, beast of nations. It's all this grisly affair.
Yeah. No, it's
whipped by some warlord or something.
The problem with that stuff is, this is what I have to say to my students in recent years, is it's a bit like, so I live in Bristol, a city in England, which has really poor, impoverished, marginalized areas and very wealthy areas. And I think what goes on in the Congo is a little bit like if I went to Bristol as a foreigner and I went to the worst parts of Bristol and I filmed it and I took videos of it, and then I just produced a film that said, this is England. And I just showed those terrible places and spaces. And I just was, I just presented that as the whole of England. That's often what takes place in Congo is people will come in from the outside. They will focus on the worst areas and the worst spaces, and they'll present that as Congo. And you have that in the mining sector. So yes, those militarized mines exist. And yes, those stories exist. But then the question is, how reflective are they of the whole? And I think that's what often gets missed. And I think the reality is they're not reflective of the whole. For every militarized mine in Congo, you have as many more that are non-militarized and that are peaceful. But, who cares about those? Because there's no story there, right? And I just feel that what you end up with is then this distorted image and understanding of the country and of the people and of the place. And so I think that's what you get from living there, basically, is you get to go beyond those photos and images of the worst places and spaces to understand there's a lot more to this than that. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's sort of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, no, because there's just so much debate, and I feel like because it's got such a lion's share of countries' economies, we sort of like tapped on almost every other issue, from climate change to sort of social, political, economic problems and privatization and everything. But I think the big question that's mostly on people's minds in all of these countries is always like a headache over how to get it right. And this could be probably like a two-pronged question. Botswana is often touted as the success story, and they got it right, but Botswana is still not the richest country, and it's not Qatar either. Even though it's a shining success story. When you look at other mineral-rich countries, you look at the UAE, Qatar, those guys were fish ports 40, 50 years ago, and now they have proper stakes in even global politics at this point. They're that bold. And Australia, Chile is one of those examples as well that they like touting around with copper-producing countries as well. So what is it that these countries did right that Africa doesn't seem to be doing? Because I mean, there's I think there were even figures of per capita, how Ghana had a higher per capita than South Korea in the 1950s, and now it's just gone.
Zambia, Singapore.
Yeah, they compare all of
Yeah.
these. So what is it that these are not
Also, Chile is number one and number two copper producing.
It's number two and number one in copper production, but it's
And then Zambia follows like somewhere right after, not too far behind. So,
number 8, number
oh, okay, yeah. So I mean, it's not a huge difference. So, I mean, but you see,
So why is it that these countries have developed in this amount of time, and many of them are developing, or they developed in the short space of time, in a time that other countries in Africa also had. So what's the difference? Like what makes them so special from countries?
$1 million
It's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a big question. I don't know we're going to get very. I mean, I don't know how far we can get with it. But it's but that's the question, and that's what everyone's thinking about, right? And conversations on the continent and conversations we're having, and these are the questions that people are asking. Right? They're looking elsewhere, and they're looking overseas. And you're right. There's all these examples. I mean, one that I heard recently was Haiti and South Korea, and Tanzania and South Korea. Right, similar per capita income levels in the 50s, and then you have these transformational processes taking place in countries, but few that appear to be on the continent. I mean, you can also look for examples on the continent. I think one interesting example, which there's a researcher, an Indian economist called Pritish Bahuria, who's done some work on Mauritius. I think I'm right in saying recently became a high income country, or upper middle income, but I think high income country. So Mauritius has gone through one of these transformational experiences. So there are also stories from the continent, but I'd also agree that Botswana which is often held as this model, I would agree with your assessment. It's still fundamentally a diamond-dependent exporting economy. And you now see that there's this story of diamonds being artificially created in factories, which is obviously terrifying to De Beers and has fundamentally changed the global diamond market potentially. And so if that were to happen, Botswana fundamentally hasn't transformed its economy. It hasn't diversified, right? Its export products in the way that the other countries you're referring to have. So yeah, it's a success story, but I think also I'd agree it's a limited one, and maybe one that can't be sustained unless there's some transformation. So in the question, we talked about industrial policy, haven't we? I think how fundamental that is. One thing that comes to mind as well, having lived in Eastern Congo for many years, right on the border of Rwanda and Burundi. One thing that was very striking to me from that experience was how often Congolese would look over the river towards Rwanda, right, and talk about what was happening in Rwanda. And often people would say, or I would say, well, at least Congo is kind of democratic, and you have, and people would say, well, you can't eat democracy. And they would sort of be looking to aware of Kagame's all the limitations and how closed politically that society is. But nonetheless, having seen Rwanda for the last 10, 15 years now, it's undeniable in terms of infrastructure, right? Infrastructural development and things that are taking place and changing in that country compared to Congo. And Congolese would look. And so, what you see in Rwanda, or what you have seen in Rwanda, is that, broadly speaking, that effort at economic transformation that comes from, a pretty centralized government that is mobilized around these kind of national developmental aims and trying to achieve something through strategic industrial policy. Now, of course, it's more complicated than that, and how far that can go in Rwanda is. But I think these approaches and ideas is broadly what you need. But the question is, well, how do you get that in place, right? If you're a Congolese looking at Rwanda and there's parts of what you see going on in Rwanda that you are kind of envious of or would like to see happening in your country, then the question is, how do you change the political settlement in Congo, or how do you change the sort of ideology and the way in which, and that's huge. So that's much more complex. That's about struggle, and that's about, that's class struggle, that's social struggle. It's not about policy and strategy, right? Because the question for Congolese is, well, how do we get to a point where we can even be considering doing that, right? Because the country seems very far from there. And then you look into the histories of countries like Rwanda or Ethiopia or South Korea, and they're often like very kind of specific contextual reasons as to why those governments come into power and begin to pursue a national developmentalist. Yeah. So it's often very country specific, isn't it? So I don't know. There is no easy answer, right? But people, as they are doing, are engaged in struggle and are engaged in pushing for that future, right? And you just need enough people to be mobilized for a long enough period of time, and hope that change will come through, I suppose. But it's the arena of struggle, right? And then there's also the question of, well, how far, to what extent and how far can things be achieved on the continent within the confines of a global capitalist economy, right? And then you get into debates around capitalism and anti-capitalism, and whether capitalism is conducive to those sorts of trajectories in many African countries, right? Because you talked about in Congo the electric battery vehicle, and this is the big thing that they're getting behind now, right? In Zambia and Congo, is this idea of industrialization through this value chain. But they're already such a late entrant to that market, right? And I feel that's the problem with lots of renewable energy technologies, which many African governments now are seemingly really going after developing manufacturing capacity. But the starting gun went off for those in the 80s and 90s, and East Asia and North America and Europe just are so dominant in those spaces. Not to say that you can't wrest that power away from them. It can be done, but I also you just think, wow, it's not going to be easy, because those markets already have so many entrants. So I don't know. I haven't given a very satisfactory answer, but you know, you need to, I would say, learn from the 60s and 70s. There's a lot there that can be dug up, but the question is how do you get those sorts of government structures in place, right? I mean, that's the much harder part, as we know from kind of comrades and activists who are involved in these sorts of struggles in various places. It's, you know, enacting that sort of change. It's not an easy thing to achieve, right? To change the way in which and we have that in the same in the UK, right? It's not the same, but it's, you know, similar struggles in the UK when you have, you know, particular governing logic, and, you know, all your main political parties are seemingly, you know, imbued with the same logic. I mean, how do you shift that, right? In a short time frame. And yeah, this is what everyone who's thinking about social change is sort of having to consider and weigh up and ask themselves these days. But I think my fundamental point, though, to your question would be the space is there, right? And things can be done and managed, and sovereignty might have been lost, but it can be reclaimed. There's no path determinism here, and there's no foreclosure of possibilities, right? What is lost can be reclaimed. I mean, that is exactly what the kind of anti-colonial movement showed us, right, in the 50s and 60s, in the 40s, 50s and 60s. You know, there's no greater example of that than overthrowing colonial power, you know, all the achievements of that period, right? So of course it can be done, but it takes a lot of mobilization and organization over long periods of time. And so, yeah, that's not easy.
I guess young people shouldn't be pessimistic. This is what I'm hearing.
No, it should get active, because it's not going to fall into our laps. It's not going to fall into our laps, is it? I mean, it has to be a struggle.
I guess the difficulty for young people is like, how do you even move into these spaces? I mean, they're so like far away. Yeah. I mean, how can little old me like try to have some sort of respect there? It's just a whole nother conversation in of itself, you know. So
yeah.
I think I don't actually had any other questions.
No, I don't have any other questions. I might grab that book that you mentioned by Congolese, and
the shameless plug.
Well, it's not my book. I'm not plugging.
Oh, yeah, sorry, your book. Sorry, my bad. Actually, I think you should plug your book. I think though.
No. No, I was actually very pleased. No, I haven't been like shamelessly plugging my own book. This was. It just happened as I was talking about. As the book came to mind, I just saw that it was on the shelf above me. But it's by African economists of the 80s. I think it was published in the late 80s or early 90s. But, you know, you're interested in that historical period we were talking about of like structural adjustment and what went wrong in the 70s and 80s and how it was addressed. This book, Our Continent, Our Future, is a must read. Yeah, it's fantastic. But I'm glad we clarified that I wasn't plugging my own book.
Yeah, sorry. But we'll definitely put the link to your website in the description for our viewers too.
Yeah,
I think it's very important. I think you also did a podcast with I forget, but there was a podcast that I also saw on your website quite a while back. Yeah, that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah.
Zengi, sorry, you're saying something?
Yeah, no, I was just agreeing with you about the podcast. Otherwise,
Okay.
Well, it's going around the entire atmosphere of the mining history and recurrent affairs of Africa.
I think, no, I think, thank you very much, Dr. Ben. Thank you so much for, for joining us. I think it's very important that you kind of highlight. First of all, thank you for being optimistic. Secondly, thank you as well for shedding some light, because I think that generally whenever I'm speaking to many African youths, it's either a lot of pessimism, number one, or number two, just a lot of, generalization. Like, I remember talking to a friend of mine who unfortunately just sort of caught on to this belief that maybe just Africans just aren't good enough at dealing into this, sort of things. it was a very popular, sort of
Yeah.
belief that perhaps that maybe it's just the fact that, Africans just aren't able to handle something like this.
Yeah.
And another one is just sort of maybe this is how, things are, and this is just how things will continue to be. So thank you very much for really coming and shedding some light, especially I like the fact that you sort of stressed the importance of the external issues that don't seem to be addressed as well. Because, a lot of the time, myself included, I think we tend to, unlike maybe in Western politics where there seems to be at least some sort of researched blame on certain particular entities, when it comes to Zambia, particularly, blame seems to fall at the feet of the president. No matter what happens, ignoring the past dependencies that sort of are there. And so I think it was really, really important that we had this conversation, especially because literally this is the engine for our countries and how I'd say like, money really comes in. Precisely, and so yeah, no, thank you very much. I really do believe that we will definitely have you on again because I think this is a very important issue, and I don't think that 1 hour was sufficient in my opinion. But yeah,
No, I'd
thank
be
you very much.
happily.
Yeah.
No, I'd happily come on again, and thank you for the invitation. And just to say, no, I mean, those stories of I've had similar conversations around the pessimism, right? And these absolutely have to be resisted and countered. And I think if anyone feels like that, right, one of the great books that people should read if they have that pessimism is Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is over 50 years old now, but I think it is a great antidote to that sort of pessimism. If you read that book, begin to see very clearly this is not either the way that things are naturally, or this is not this idea of. I mean, I know we're running out of time, I'm sure, but it does remind me of many conversations I had with Congolese that I often was really shocked by to begin with. Was Congolese who would say to me, well, the Belgians are better than us, they're smarter than us, they knew how to run the country. And this is a very common view that I heard a lot talking with young and old Congolese when I was living there. And yeah, I mean, that is, you have these ideas, this art defeats. Yeah. And Zenga, your question about what can Africa do right that other countries haven't done, you often get these cultural explanations of why other countries have succeeded, right? Either Confucianism in the East or Protestantism, the work ethic of Europeans, right? Yeah. And then, implicit within that narrative, what's implicit within all of that for Africans, it's that, Africans don't have the right work ethic, right? Or don't have the right culture. So, I mean, they're sort of racist explanations fundamentally, when you think about it, because what they're implying is others who have not achieved a similar path or a similar trajectory to us do not contain these required cultural attributes, right? And so, we have to absolutely seek different explanations and understandings because it's a dead end otherwise. But as you point out, it's sadly very prevalent. It is very prevalent, and I think it is. It's one of the reasons you're doing this you're having these conversations, I guess. And then lastly, just quickly to stay on the state. I mean, just a final point. If you think about the Congo, which is a country of around 100 million people, what's their annual budget of their government is something like $6 or $7, maybe $8 billion, right? Which is probably, I don't know, a decent, the same or less than a city in Germany would have, or a European city might have. So I think often you could flip the question on its head to my mind and think how remarkable are some of the achievements that take place within such limited means. What can you achieve with that sort of government budget that you have? I think often the assumption is these government bodies or state agencies and offices are incredibly, inefficient and corrupt and wasteful. You could flip it the other way around and say, they're under-resourced and perhaps they're overachieving relative to the resources they have, right? I mean, there's a lot of research to be done there, I think, and different ways of thinking about it. But the resource, like you say, the constraints on trying to achieve sustained kind of transformational development are very significant, both internal and external constraints. And I think, that is often lost when people try and think about or understand kind of development problematic, broadly speaking, in Africa.
I just wanted to also point out the last of my points, because I also it kind of puts me on the spot as well for my own. I have to check my own pessimism because, but it could be true. I often complain and say, the DRC has a mineral wealth of 24 trillion, and that's the figure that's always thrown around. Mineral wealth potential of 24 trillion, and I'm like, if the DRC had even had the operational efficiency of Nigeria or India, they would be one of the richest countries in the world. Not even an advanced level or developed country level efficiency in taxation and wealth accumulation. They would be an advanced country. But at the same time, there's also lots of various factors that, as we said, come in, and when you flip it over, it couldn't just be governments, it could be also the different restrictions that are within the government, even a well-intentioned government, trying to accumulate wealth and redistribute it. I think just being in the government of Congo is just a nightmare, probably.
Yeah. I mean, it's also not, it's not to completely completely deny, the appropriation that's taking place by the political class in Congo. That is obviously taking place, but I do think that we just tend to focus far too much on that still today, to the exclusion of sort of thinking about other factors that are going on there. But look, thanks. It's been great talking to you both, and thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you as well to our listeners for joining us. Be sure to follow us on all platforms. Hit that notification bell on whatever streaming platform you're listening to this to. If you're watching this on YouTube, again, please be sure to subscribe and share, and see you guys next time.
I am an African.